Support for the CivicSciTV network comes from viewers, readers, and listeners like you, and organizations such as the Berlin Science Week and the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Visit civicscitv.org to learn more about our network of programs.
Exploring societal challenges through the lens of civic science. This is the Perspective Program with host Diya Dwarakanath.
Hi, and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Diya Dwarakanath, and today we're discussing climate justice, which combines climate science, climate policy, and advocacy. We have the pleasure of being joined by Denise Lopez, the Outreach and Organizing Manager of 350 PDX, a nonprofit organization local to Portland, Oregon. Lopez is an environmental sociologist with a background in global health studies as well. Welcome, Denise.
Hi, Diya. Thanks for having me.
Yes. All right. Let's connect the dots. So I like to start with definitions. What is 350 PDX in a sentence or two?
350 PDX is a local climate justice group all about helping everyday people find some sort of climate action that feels right to them. We've got a variety of campaigns, and we do a little bit of everything.
That's good to know. And what is 350 PDX's theory of change? Put it another way, what is the principle on which you can change how things are done to make them better?
That's a great question. We use a lot of theories, environmental justice theories that prioritize frontline communities. All of our campaigns, decisions, work is really guided by that principle of prioritizing in climate justice those that are disproportionately affected. And in all of our campaigns and our work, that's a major thread, especially as an organization that is white-founded, mostly white-led. The 350 really started as a bridging the space from traditional environmental groups to the environmental justice, climate justice groups that we have now.
That's good to know. And to continue on that, you mentioned climate justice. So what is that?
Yeah, it's sometimes it's tough to describe. The idea, climate justice, environmental justice, is really thinking about that we are seeing a lot of impacts from climate change, and they need to be addressed in a way that is holistic, knowing that it touches on so many different angles. So it's not just environmental, it's housing, economic, there's impacts on health and safety. So it's the justice piece is incorporating that holistic view and also the prioritization of there's people that are extra vulnerable, and you want to make sure that they have that priority and we're taking care of them first.
Absolutely. And I definitely want to get into what that looks like for you. But before we get into that, I want to get through some of these concepts and definitions. One thing I think makes this a pressing issue is that our show, we tend to use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals framework for diving into issues from a civic science journalism perspective. And I think your work and your organization's work falls under Goal 13. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. And you're working with people to raise that awareness and build resilience. And I recall that one of the, from your website and from what I've heard is that there are 3 prongs of work that you really focus on. And one of them is around Goal 11 of the United Nations, which is makes cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And that includes providing accessible and safe green spaces for everyone. So can you tell us about those 3 prongs of your organization and how that ties into these United Nations goals?
Yeah, we try to do a little bit of everything. My work definitely touches more on the inclusivity and resilience piece. The reason I was hired at 350 was to create neighborhood teams. The idea of having hyper-localized climate resilience hubs, knowing that even in Portland, right, not even thinking like global, but even in Portland, each neighborhood has different priorities, but we are fairly diverse in that regard. And so each neighborhood focusing on various climate resilience projects and also building community will be in a better place to start combating and mitigating effects from climate change. And the advocacy piece, I think, is pretty major. There's a lot of feelings, right, around climate change, and especially as in the news in the past couple of weeks with hurricanes, we've been seeing the immediate impacts, and that can lead to a lot of the feelings of being overwhelmed, fear, and that's not super conducive to making any progress on climate change operating from that place. So we strive to create a lot of the opportunities for people to take direct action immediately in the short term, and also thinking long term with projects like neighborhood teams. And for our prongs, the way I always describe our campaigns is we have a team focused on climate policy. So for those that like to get into the weeds, that like thinking big picture, a forest defense team, that especially for all the tree huggers in the Northwest, and also those that are really focused on shade equity, and a fossil fuel resistance team focused especially on fighting, and they fight some really big battles against Northwest Natural, Zenith, and some of the big polluters in the city.
Okay. And as you know, as we get into those later in the conversation, is there any other concepts or definitions that you think our audience should know as we talk about this further?
I think one thing that comes to mind for me are frontline communities, since everyone has a little bit of definition, especially when thinking about those most impacted. People will think of low-income communities, communities of color, disabled communities, immigrants, those whose English is not their first language, different learning disability, just covering the whole gambit of those that are most vulnerable. And that is all encompassed by the term frontline community. That way you don't have to include every single community that you can think of. So frontline communities, to most of the work that we do in Portland, means those that are most impacted and encompasses that whole range of groups.
Thank you for that. That's helpful to know. So let's continue at a high level with an executive summary, and then we can dig deeper. So as you mentioned, you mentioned these frontline communities. What does your organization do to really bring frontline communities into local climate policy conversations and work with them?
Yeah, it means creating a seat at the table for them. We are fortunate in Portland to have so many community-led groups like Verde, the Latino Environmental Group, Coalition of Communities of Color, the Oregon Just Transition Alliance. So there are these groups that exist sometimes, and especially at the beginning of the kind of movement in Portland, not everyone was given a seat at the table, and that was the first priority. Easy thing that a group can do is just creating that access point. Once you're in the door, it's so much easier to be being part of the decisions and sharing your thoughts, your opinions, your stories, your community perspectives that might differ from what is typically heard. The other piece too is supporting the work. 350 is part of a whole range of coalitions on all of the prongs, the campaigns that we work on. It's all of our space is very coalition led. It's not just one group deciding. It's a whole team effort. And in those spaces, having that, not just making space, but also prioritizing and uplifting is the other key part of how 350 works with frontline communities.
Can you expand on that last one? What does prioritizing and uplifting mean?
Yeah, so if like thinking of the shade equity team in forest defense, Portland loves its trees, and we have a lot of them. The priorities of, I don't know, a team in Southwest Portland where there's already an abundance are going to be very different from in East Portland, where we know that there's a lack of trees, a lack of shade, and it's significantly higher temperatures in the summer than the rest of Portland. Knowing that there's different communities in Portland that have preferences, and there's limited funding, limited energy, time, will to make projects happen. Prioritizing frontline communities looks like, okay, let's make sure that a neighborhood in East Portland, like say Lentz, has priority for funding, or that we're actively making sure that we're looking for grant opportunities. We're sending volunteers there, putting a lot of the active effort on the thinking about action, making sure that it's happening there first. And also just listening, taking action, making sure that we're taking care of the community.
Okay, thank you. And to go back to an earlier point about providing a seat at the table, how do you actually reach and find the frontline communities to give them that seat at the table or to invite them to work with you?
Yeah, that's a lot of what my job is, especially as an engagement person. A lot of it is one, like you have to know your community. So I was going to start fresh, I would be spending a lot of time in community centers. I'll just use like my neighborhood in Portland, Brentwood. I would be showing up at the neighborhood association meetings, at local churches, knowing that the BIPOC market, making sure that like one, I like know who's there, and you start to get a sense for who are the community leaders, and that's where you start talking to them, seeing what their opinions are. This type of inclusive engagement is a long process. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a while to get to know people, build the trust, learn their priorities. Sometimes it means envisioning what you had in mind, especially if you come in with a preconceived notion of what might be best, which I think is a big problem, especially with researchers coming into communities. Sometimes there's that tension piece. In any case, and if I wanted to, I was working in a new area in East Portland and I wanted to make sure they had the seat at the table, that's where I would start, is getting to know the community first. And then once I have like a couple people in mind that I know have the expertise, they're interested, they're passionate, they have a lot to offer, then it's making sure that any meetings I'm at, any coalition spaces, they're invited to, they feel welcome, which is the other piece. You can have the invitation, but if you don't feel like you're going to be heard or listened to, or like you're going to be welcome, it's really tough to want to come back and go through that grueling process. So that's the other piece too, is making sure that it's an inviting and welcoming space.
Okay. And you mentioned something about researchers coming in and how sometimes that can cause tension because of some of the preconceived notions they may come in with. So I find that interesting. Can we talk more about that? What does that mean?
Oh yeah.
What do you recommend to researchers who are watching this in terms of how they could be coming in instead?
Yeah, I was thinking about the city you had sent over. I had some thoughts and opinions, and I think especially in the justice realm, whether it's environmental justice, social justice, there needs to be a little bit more caution and I don't know what the word is, but there needs to be a little bit more thoughtfulness about how communities are approached, and especially in communities of color too, where there's historic distrust in government, where there has been exploitation, stories have been used without permission, consent has been a big issue. When my career was in around sociology research, and that was such a huge piece of letting the community lead the research, and especially since my field was community-based participatory research, it was all led by the community. And I worked in areas where they weren't super excited about a university coming in and wanting to learn about them, even if it was like positioned as, we have a lot of great ideas of how we might help or like solve X or Y problem, but because of the previous hurt, it was really tough for them to feel like, okay, like, can we even like open ourselves up? So my recommendation, and it feels like in recent years, this is not as much of a problem anymore. I'm thinking more like 7 years ago. But my recommendation is always like the start slow, like I was saying with engagement. Take your time, get to know, and also have some criteria or evaluation in mind of how are you going to make sure that the community is being, their priorities and needs are being taken care of outside of what the like research metrics might be. Sometimes it's tough with timelines, with grants. You kind of have to work a little bit quickly, but it can be a tough balance. But as long as you're making sure that your community feels satisfied and respected, everyone will leave happy and excited to tackle another project.
Okay, that's good to know, and it sounds like you have a lot of that firsthand knowledge of doing this work. So, can you share perhaps a one or two do's and don'ts, some specifics that our audience can take away?
Yeah, I'm like, how do I narrow it down? One do is listen and have an open mind. Sometimes, like what you come in of like, I want to do like plant these many trees in this neighborhood isn't exactly going to be what the community has in mind. Be flexible also with that because it might require changing timelines or funding. Don't come in yelling, charging ahead, like be respectful. And especially too in communities of color where there is so much respect for elders, there's just a lot different culture. The don't would be make sure I'm making this as a do, but the don't is yeah.
Yeah, okay, no, that's helpful. And I think sometimes it's hard if someone has a preconceived notion for them to recognize it. So if there is some notions you've seen that are not helpful, then it would be useful, to share them. So if you have any, we can, or we can move to the um, next point because there's tons we can talk about here.
Say that last part again.
Yeah, like are there any preconceived notions that you think that you've seen people have, and some, because sometimes it's hard for people to be aware that they even have it, or if there's nothing that comes to mind, we can move to my next question.
Yeah, I think there's a sense, or one that I come across a lot, is that communities of color, frontline communities, need to feel that your if your goal is to make them feel empowered, like they're missing something already. Oftentimes, there's already a lot of expertise, especially projects that focus on raising awareness, coming in with that kind of mentality of like, I am going to teach you something you don't already know, versus okay, there's a lot of like different lived experiences, different knowledge that we can harness here. So I feel like and also a lot of the kind of programs I've seen that focus on the empowerment don't really address also the root cause of why a community might feel like they like don't have a lot of voice or power or ability to change anything. So that would be the main one I think of, is just thinking that a community is hopeless and not able to do anything.
Thank you. That's a really useful one, I think, for our audience to be aware of. And I want to get back to some of these other questions, but this was such a valuable part of our discussion. So one broader question I have for you is, what would you happen to include all of our voices to adapt to the changing climate? Like, what would be your ultimate success metric?
Can you say that one more time? It cut out in the middle.
Oh, sure. What would you like to see happen to include all of our voices in adapting to this changing climate?
Ooh, what would I like to see happen? I think a blend of things. I mean, funding always comes to mind to me of like, that's usually a big barrier. I'd love to have unlimited money to make this happen. And creating space for the community as well. I think especially when you're focused on inclusivity, there's such a power to being in person and having a space to call your own. So I feel like those are the two things I think about the most. Like once you have the funding, you have a space, it's a lot easier to get people in line. Having a couple charismatic leaders that can kind of tackle everything for you as well. You always need good food. That's a requirement for sure, especially with some of the groups I work with. If there's not good food, they're not going to show up. And I think also just having something for everyone, knowing that, especially something like climate justice as an example, if I want everyone to be involved, it's not everyone is really interested in the technical piece. Not everyone is interested in the like showing up at events and rallies. They would rather be behind the scenes and doing something else. So I think that's the other piece too, outside of like, once you have all of the physical, like barriers met, making sure that everyone is able to participate. And especially with 350 PDX being mostly volunteer run with so many hundreds of volunteers that we rely on. There's something for everyone, and everyone kind of has a different role to play. So I feel like once you find those, once you start matching the needs to the volunteers, that's how we've been really successful in making sure that everyone is able to do something.
Okay. So would you say that 350 PDX's approach, what makes your approach different from other nonprofit climate organizations is the coalition building, the prioritizing frontline communities, and trying to find different roles for different people based on interest?
Yeah, I think so. I think we, having worked mostly at environmental nonprofits, the unique thing for me is definitely how many volunteers 350 has, and also how well they run on their own too. Because I've worked in spaces where you rely on a lot on volunteers, but it requires a staff person to like make sure that things are running. They still have to do a lot. And for example, our forest defense team, Brenna, who's the forest climate manager, has done an amazing job. That team runs so smoothly. They plan full events, rallies, and teach-ins, and it doesn't require a lot of staff time, which I haven't seen before, where there's so many passionate, willing people where they just take an idea and run with it. And I think that's a really unique aspect of working at 350.
That's good to hear. And what do you think, from the work you've done and what others in your team have done as well at 350 PDX, like what actionable advice do you have for others doing similar work? If they were watching this, and what could they take away from what, some actionable advice they could take away? What would you tell them?
I think keep it fun and creative. One of the benefits to our physical office space and work is that it's a really fun place to be. There's a lot of gorgeous art. There's like books, there's murals and posters and like banners from previous events. And like I mentioned at the beginning, with all of the feelings around climate and how hard it is to sometimes bring people into the movement, I think the biggest thing people can do is make it a fun, exciting event. Like you're tackling something huge, it should be fun. It shouldn't be like, oh my gosh, like I have to go to a meeting and like talk about this policy. It should be like, oh, I'm so excited. Like we're gonna work really hard on this campaign to make sure that we stop this big polluter. And one of our campaigns right now is in a huge comment period, and they do such a good job of making it fun. They're sassy. They've got some pizzazz to them. And I think that the more groups, especially since you might want to put on like a very professional front and be like a little more serious, that's my main advice. Make it fun. You'll have a wider range of volunteers and community members. And also, like as a staff person too, it really helps with not feeling so burnt out and frazzled when you're actually having fun at work.
Okay. Bring the fun. I like that. What is the biggest or most surprising lesson learned about bringing justice to frontline communities?
Ooh, something surprising. I don't know. That's a tough one. I don't know. I think I'm always surprised at how much people give. I guess it's kind of like a cheesy takeaway. I know that there's always going to be people that are so generous in donating their time, their energy, their, like all the resources they have. But it's still always surprising. Like the past couple of weeks, we have been organizing candidate forums across the city for the upcoming Portland City Council election, which is new and unique. And we've had so many volunteers for that, where I thought that we'd have to find contractors or like, I don't know, like we wouldn't be able to do certain things. And it's always surprising, even though I know that we have that great base, but how much people show up when you really need them. And it's a special lesson, especially in the field where it feels like there's always so much pressure and like you have to do things right. Know that we have this great community and they're always going to show up.
That's amazing. And we could go on. I know there was more we were going to discuss around shade equity and some of these other topics. So perhaps that's going to be for a time when we can have you back on the show. And one last question, a bonus one, before we wrap up. is, can you tell us very quickly about your staff collective model and how you've managed to keep it working even in a challenging time when perhaps you couldn't find consensus?
Yeah, that's always top of mind. 350 is very unique in that we have a non-hierarchical model. There's no executive director. It's the staff of 7 making decisions. We're really fortunate that most of the time we're on the same page. It's not we're not pulling teeth to make a decision. I think that the harder part, especially with now an executive director, is when we decide something, making it happen. Because we could have a great idea and say we're going to start a new program, and we decide everyone's on board, it's exciting, and then nothing happens. So I think the implementation actually is much harder sometimes than even the consensus. When we have had some disagreements, and especially too in the season of elections and so many campaigns going on at the same time, I think we're also fortunate to have so much experience on staff as well, where we kind of run the gambit from age, work experience, and it kind of leaders come out from that, where we have some people that end up being the facilitators and trying to find a creative solution. Sometimes it's not necessarily what we think might happen as an outcome of we're deciding between A and B and it ends up being F, a completely different option. So it's even though sometimes it can be a little stressful when we can't decide, it's at least always creative, which I appreciate.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to say thank you, and thank you to our audience for watching. Remember, science is civic. And with that, thank you so much again to you, Denise, for your time and energy on the show today.
Thank you, Diya. It was fun being here.